So the title of this talk is Art and Shadow. I think that it's important to talk about shadow. I like to relate it to Peter Pan, and if you have seen that movie, at the beginning, Peter loses his shadow and needs to catch it and sew it back on. And to be alive, to be human, we all cast a shadow. Carl Jung is famous for formulating the concept of the shadow. The portion of our personality through the course of our life is regulated to the darkness of the unconscious. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it gets. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. And this is an example of one of my early paintings. All right. And this is a painting I painted about 2005. This is a painting that is this big. It's like 8 by 10 inches. And it is a self-portrait. Now, for art majors, I don't know how many self-portraits you've had to do throughout your life, but as an undergrad, at one point, somebody told me to do another self-portrait, and I walked right out of the class and got into somebody else's class because I was tired of looking at myself, even though you're always available and you can look at yourself in the mirror. This painting was done after graduate school, and I hadn't painted myself in a while, and then my life became so burdened, so I wouldn't call it tragic, but just a lot of very stressful things happened, and it was interesting that I showed up in my work again. I based it off of this painting that I saw in Munich, and I just thought it was so mysterious. You had to read the hang tag next to the painting. All right, so this painting was really mysterious. This is done by an artist named Kronach. He's German, and this is called Venus Complaining to Cupid. Venus here, shown naked, is nubile, and she is talking to this infant Cupid, and he looks like he's holding a football. So I was just like, what's going on? It turns out that that is not a football, it is a honeycomb. And he, Cupid, has taken the honey and is getting stung by the bees. And Venus is saying, tisk, tisk, if you go after the honey, you're gonna get stung. So this is also like a parable or a metaphor, how you tell a story through a story. It's about love. And so I photographed myself and I put these big eyes on top of it. During this time period, I worked a lot with collage and putting masks on things. That mask is from Our Man of Sorrow. There are historical Catholic paintings, Our Lady and Our Man of Sorrow, and I could not myself talk about the things that were happening in my life, but somehow if I put that mask on top, one, it separated me from like personal tragedy. It was like connecting to the suffering that happens within compassion for all people, but also when you wear a mask, you're not yourself, so you can play out something that might be hidden or secret more publicly. So it gave me this ability to put myself in my work, be me, but not be me. I don't know if you all have ever had a breakthrough in your work. Sometimes the breakdown and the breakthrough are indistinguishable. When I was in graduate school, I got so fed up of my own love for the old masters. There are 400 years of paintings that are so good. I was like, what do I have to contribute to this, and how can I ever paint as well as they could? So I went back to my studio one day and I tore the spines off those books and I cut them up and I started to play with the material. So I would make collage out of historical pictures, but also put some of my own pictures inside. And so that last painting is a byproduct of this process. And I think it's also working out of shadow, getting so fed up, you bust out, and needing to play, but also to create a world. All of that art history, that 400 years, didn't have any women in it, and I wanted to put myself in it. So I could cut that apart and include myself. So between 2004 and 2010, I painted a lot of these, and the figures were always crying. They always had those masks. And I realized at some point I had painted myself in a corner. I had trapped myself. I started to get well known with this work that was really sad. And the place that I went to within myself in order to make this work, I was nursing or milking my own injury in order to connect. So one thing was finding a place of sorrow to go into and to cathartic, to share my emotions. But also it was another level of realizing there was so much energy within that place that I would purposely go somewhere. Like, I'll give you an example. My daddy doesn't love me enough. I didn't need to go there that often to access that energy. So I think by going there in that way, it created an undertow. And I started to attract more darkness, more suffering, and more tragedy into my own life. So I'll give an example of another one of the paintings I painted that had that, I call it like a citation style, or telling a story through a story. So cutting up, this is one Virgin Mary, and this is another Virgin Mary, and this is from another painting, this is from another painting. All of these fragments I'd put together and then tell a story. So this is called The Bride Stripping the Bachelor's Bare, which is a remix of a Duchamp title called The Bride Being Stripped Bare by the Bachelor's Even, which Duchamp said was about male and female lust, but really it sounded kind of misogynistic. So in this tale, this woman has fallen into the subterranean universe of female lust, a very dark place. And why? Because when you are a maiden and you get married, you transform from maiden to bride to wife. This is an alchemical process where you change to yourself, to your family, to the community, to everyone who knows you, and the rules are not really the same for men. So if you step outside of those laws of your commitment, in this interpretation, her head has separated from her body. She has no eyes. In her fingers right here is her wedding ring, and her hand fell off. So she is just about as damned as you can get. But I put a ladder in the background. If she can find that, she can get out whenever she likes. Because probably partially she put herself there. So some of these stories are ways that I could release myself from the pain and suffering I was having in my own life. Because the reason you'd leave a marriage is not one-sided. I guess the last thing I will say about that was how then, if I kept painting sorrow, could I change my relationship to it? When we are forced into a confrontation with our shadow, it is either the result of being overwhelmed with self-destructive behavior, addiction, or a general stagnation and apathetic attitude. For sickness can be a stimulant to health, and a meeting with the shadow can mark the beginning of psychological rebirth. It is only when we are compelled by sickness to come to terms with our own nature that the opportunity may arise for us to experience the somber experience of the shadow as a messenger from the creative potential that lives within our own psyche. It is part of the destiny of modern humans that our way should lead us down to the depths, not up to the heights. Is it then surprising that the guide who meets us as we journey should not turn out to be a shining angel of light, but the shadow figure of our own evil? James Hillman says, the unconscious cannot be conscious. The moon has its dark side. The sun goes down and cannot shine everywhere at once, and even God has two hands. Attention and focus require some things to be out of the field of vision to remain in the dark. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of a little weaknesses or foibles, but to be positively dynamic and with demonic dynamism. So the shadow goes by many different names: the disowned self, the lower self, the dark twin, the double, the repressed self, the alter ego, meeting our demons, wrestling with the devil, descent into the underworld, dark night of the soul, and possibly a midlife crisis. Liz Green points out to us that the paradoxical nature of the shadow as both container of darkness and a beacon pointing to the light, it is the suffering, crippled side of the personality, which is both the dark shadow that won't change and also the redeemer that transforms one's life and alters one's values. The shadow is both the awful thing that needs redemption and the suffering redeemer who can provide it. So here's another example. This is called Melancholia with Demons. This is from 2006, and it is so humorous for me to see these projected because the original painting was this big. So I would paint these very intense, intimate pictures with tiny brushes and go nuts for, close to 100 hours. Has anybody read Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar? So this is to Mrs. Victoria Lucas, which was one of her pseudonyms, and writing a letter to her, I think about my own suffering, like somebody who was creative, artistic, and dealing with great adversity. And in writing that letter to her, in that lowest, most intimate place of pain, and you can see what the demons are doing. They're laughing. They love self-misery, sorrow. It makes them so happy, and it makes you so ridiculous. So I was also aware, and that's what's interesting about consciousness, is you can be totally aware of something and locked out of comprehension, of consciousness, of how to change your life. What else can I say about this? I think that I noticed by focusing on my own pain and the art that it was generating, well, it became very complicated because I started to be in magazines, the work started to sell, and I felt like a blues singer. And I wondered then, of all of those female singers, the ones that die not prettily, if you get famous for pouring out your soul, and you have to do it night after night after night, if you don't cause your own self-destruction. So, where does shadow come from? During our development, certain traits and impulses were condemned by our family members, peers, educators, not out of care, but out of envy, fear, ignorance, or jealousy. Our proclivity to abide by social expectations also caused us to repress talents, innate abilities, impulses, which if cultivated and developed, had the potential to make us more effective beings in the world. And I'll give you an example. When you're a little child, age under 5, and you behave badly, they tell you not to do that thing. Stop doing that. Or you go to school and you act out. Stop doing that. All of those training behaviors, the nose, pushes us part of ourselves, the natural funny part of ourselves, or the speaker, the one who wanted to talk a lot. It pushes it into the shadow, and we start to separate more and more under that conditioning of society. So then you get repressed, and the opposite of repressed would be express. So repression is evil. Shadow gains if it is repressed. Humankind evolves through shadow like the immune system. The split self is damaging. The shadow is the hiding place of stress, fear, and it keeps us unconscious. So how this played out in my own work, like I told you, I had painted myself into a corner. How do you paint yourself out? And each one of my paintings, I would follow a different idea, and I wasn't really good at making a series. So, as a teacher, one of the main assignments that I give is how do you make a series, because it was one of the hardest things for me to do, and I didn't have a teacher help me with that. So this is really one of my first series. Notice they all have to be the same size, similar format. I did have the same model. This is a friend of mine. So in this one, I am using Frank Frank Stockton's story, Lady or Tiger, a story from the 1930s. And in that tale, it is about an Oriental king who has a daughter. And in this kingdom, she falls in love not with a prince, but with a peasant. So he's in trouble with dad, with the king. And they put him inside of an arena. And the way that they decide your fate is you get to pick between two doors. Behind one door is a tiger that will eat you. And behind the other door is a beautiful woman that you can marry. So this was a very popular story that was printed in Harper's Bazaar. And why? Because it became a cliffhanger. They didn't tell you the answer, but right before that prince walked up to the door, he looked into the audience, into the princess's eyes, hoping she would give him a clue, because she knew which door was which. And that leaves it on you to understand, like, what would you have done? Would you allow the person you're the most in love with to pick the beautiful woman and be married to her instead of you? Or would you pick the tiger and let him be eaten so he was all yours? So I consider this to be like conflict. And I like Lady or Tiger because sometimes we self-sabotage. It also depends on the circumstances. I can be a lady and then you treat me badly or you withdraw food and I'll be a tiger. But I think we all have duality in our nature. But I like to think of that one as conflict. A year later, I started this one. I was asked to paint a painting about Watership Down, another great story. This one, it's a novel. Watership Down is a really thinly veiled metaphor, another analogy, an allegory for World War II. So while the rabbits are at war, the rabbits are us. And within this, because the rabbits are a metaphor for us, I have taken the same model. The lace over her eyes has small skulls in it, and in her headdress that has gold leaf in it, it is a Gothic moth, but when I reversed the moth's wings, there's the face of a rabbit within there. So she has become Enlil, this idea of the death rabbit, not a grim reaper, but this loving death that takes the broken body and absorbs it back into the mantle of the earth. And within this, I was conscious of my own death, not in that I would literally die, but metaphorically, I needed to go somewhere else with my work and in my life. And in this one, this is called Butterfly Lovers. This time it's just a tale, but a tale often told in opera that's very similar to Romeo and Juliet. Within Romeo and Juliet, you have two lovers who have a love that cannot last or be together. And at the end of Shakespeare, they die, and there's nothing to be resolved. Within this one, they are reincarnated after their death to be butterflies. So within the butterfly are all of the re's: reincarnation, restitution. We have those often seen with Easter, resurrection, and you have a promise for something that is redeeming. So where this goes in my work now, I changed the focus of how I was dealing with shadow, and I decided I had done the work on myself long enough, and I needed to focus on the shadow of the world, which it has plenty of. And I wrote a grant to go to Italy, to Siena, and that is a historical place in the 13th century. This small place outside of Florence was one of the first places. It didn't have democracy, but they had an oligarchy. They had a council of the nine that would look out for the interests of the people. And this is significant because before that, what they had was plague and tyranny. So if you were a peasant, you had no rights and nobody was going to speak for you. But once they had these 9 people who were going to represent their own people and make decisions on that behalf, they built a tower, a civic center. So when those men walked in to make their decisions, there were murals on the wall. And on one side was bad government, and on the other side was good government. And then they could reflect on their actions and decide who they were going to be today. Are they going to represent what is bad? War, destruction. This is tyranny. Justice is wrapped up like a mummy. And it's about greed and avarice and lies. And why it's damaged there is that fresco, the wall got wet, and it's got damage. So I went home. I locked myself in my house over Christmas break, and I took that pile of paper that I work from, and I made this. And this is a little smaller than the actual size, but it was really a arduous thing. Putting things on the wall with tape, tearing it down, putting it back up, watching the whole thing fall off the wall. But it was sort of like being the pregnant woman who's pacing and the man who's waiting for the baby. It was just a lot of labor. And at the end, I had this. I knew it was going to look a little like Alice in Wonderland, but I was going to interpret tyranny, rage. This is one of my own. That's self-misery. And I think that might be like a shadow creature of myself. Pride or hubris is like my Alice in Wonderland. And we didn't used to be able to spot this one so much, but that's sloth or narcissism. And I'm going to go back. Originally, he had an extra member there, but I decided I'd like to show it in more places, so it's just within his pants. So, and why? For any of you who have ever been on a board or faculty meeting and there's some blowhard that wants to absorb all the energy, we're trying to have progress, we're trying to make things work, and they're just getting off listening to the sound of their own voice. So if this is bad government, teacups full of blood, what is the solution, or what are we, what is there to gain by just representing how bad it can be? I guess the crux or the major impact of this was I realized these aren't just critiques on external things, that bad government is inside of us. It's potentially in every one of us. That in your mind is your garden, what you plant there grows. And if you allow these voices in your head, then you live with these things. You live with demons in your own mind because you're not bouncing how you think. And that was really profound, that the potential for good government or bad government starts here. So are you going to allow yourself, like self-misery here in the middle, he's got a mouse talking to a sock puppet, to represent those internal voices of, oh, they're talking about me, they hate me, they always make me sign up for that committee. This is a bat, is the face underneath, that's so weird. And then the eyes of Christ, because it's a martyr. And kind of like batshit crazy, all these metaphors have something in truth, and I'm trying to play back and forth with that. Or rage, just allowing yourself to be angry about everything and attack everything. Tyranny, wanting everything for yourself, even the crown is being consumed. And then this one was interesting. How is Alice hubris or pride? Well, Alice just wants her tea. She doesn't want to address the smell of burning bodies, of what's happening over the hill. She doesn't want to address the atrocities. She just wants to go back to her propriety and have everything be calm and normal and not deal with what's really going on. So then, what's good government? And I was in trouble there because I really had no idea. So the murals told me that it was about prosperity and weddings. All of these are metaphorical pieces of the puzzle. Peace and education is in there. Also temperance, so virtues that help make a good government. And this is a pastoral countryside with agriculture. But this one was really tricky. What in the world is that? It's like a mermaid angel with a gallows. And my Italian was never really good, so I was like, well, I'm never going to know what that says. And then I spelled it out, and it says securitas, security. And when I understood that, that made me cry, because it means that in order to have good government, you have to kill someone to protect your interest. And I didn't like that at all. So this crazy thing came out, and it's not like anything I ever painted before, and I wouldn't spend so much time on this, but these two paintings are at your Albany Museum of Art right now. And I think it's part of the narrative, like when you see work from an artist, where did they come from, what did they do, and where are they now? So good government got weird. I think if you lock yourself in your house with your own creative process, genius and madness are real close to each other. But I started with the world on fire. I knew I wanted an apocalypse, but I didn't know why. And then this happened. And what is that? And it was like, well, if we all believe that when we die we're going somewhere else, if we kill the planet, probably it's going to go somewhere else. It's going to go to heaven and turn into a new baby blue ball and start over. So very metaphorical. And then the dialogue you get creatively in your head said, find the turtle. There's a turtle in all this paper on the floor. Okay, find the turtle, put the turtle up. Then it said, find the lotus. Okay, there's a lotus. And then it telegraphed up into this new being from the dying world into the fresh one. Later, because that was bizarre, later I would read that in Hindu mythology, that when the world dies, Vishnu turns himself into a turtle, and through his navel, he births the new world in the form of a lotus again. And I've had world religion, but I don't recall that at all. So I tried to put Christian symbols, Gnostic symbols, and this is the old picture. Do I have the new one? So eventually this becomes the axis mundi, and it becomes the weighing of the heart. You can see the underpainting here. So the heart is being weighed against the feather of Matt. You're going to have to use your imagination, because this is before I finish the painting. Wrong picture. But what does that mean? If any of you are familiar with Egyptian mythology, when you die, you have to answer what they say are the 38 laws, and they are beyond the 10 Commandments, and they have some really good ones in there. Like, I have not poisoned the water, and I have not eaten more than I am full, and things that I think we probably needed. Some of them are not applicable anymore, but good government is sort of like God government. What do we need to have an internal resurrection? And according to Thomas Jefferson, every generation needs a revolution. But if revolution means war or bloodshed, that's terrible. But if revolution means you need to look into your life deeply and go, this doesn't serve me, then you can like reincarnate in this own lifetime by making different choices. The other quote I like is Frank Herbert says, government's a myth. When you stop believing in government, it dies. So how do we create self-governance? How do we create a government that governs us? Becomes something more mutable, and choices about making internal change. All right, here we go back in. Every ego has a shadow. This is unavoidable. In adapting to and coping with the world, the ego quite unwittingly employs the shadow to carry out unsavory operations that it could not perform without falling into moral conflict. Without the ego's knowledge, these protective and self-serving activities are carried out in the dark. The shadow operates much like the nation's espionage system, without the explicit knowledge of the head of state, who is therefore allowed to deny culpability, although introspection can, to some extent, bring these shadow ego operations to consciousness. The ego's own defenses against shadow awareness are usually so effective that little can penetrate them. And you may hear people critique ego. That's also a Tribe Called Quest song. But I think shadow is the thing we really need to address. So there are different analogies for this. This is Freud's version that what is conscious mind is that tip of the iceberg, and this is everything else underneath. And that is your fears, your violent motives, unacceptable desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences. And then I like this one better. Same metaphor, but what else is in there? Which is, this is what we call reality up here, but what's down here is your creativity. So if you are repressing, suppressing yourself, you are not expressing yourself. And this is what we lose, is the deep relationship with who we were going to be, the gifts that we have, and what we can deliver. The problem of integrating the shadow is a moral and psychological problem of the most thorny sort. If a person completely shuns the shadow, life is proper, but is terribly incomplete. By opening up to the shadow experience, however, a person becomes tainted with immorality, but attains a greater degree of wholeness. This is truly the devil's bargain. So I'll use an example that happened in my own life to describe this. I've studied a lot of yoga and meditation, and I've studied with people who went to India, so they have to save up a lot of money to go meet a guru, meet a teacher, and you have a lot of expectations on that when you go around the world to go find someone who's going to bring you into your higher self and make you more flexible. So this teacher of mine went all the way there, and they waited for hours for this man to arrive. And when he arrived, in walks this dark-skinned man with kind of a diaper on, like a white cloth, and then he stands in front of all of them and he says, "At the end of this workshop, you will all become serial killers." Which just shocked her to pieces, you know. But why? Because he was hoping to integrate them, to unleash something that was repressed, but to make them whole. Not literally a serial killer, but just to unrepress them. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. So this is the wonderful work of Carol Walker, and her shadows, her silhouettes, speaking about the inequality and tragedy from our nation's history and the issues with slavery. The integration of the shadow cannot take place and be put to a useful purpose unless one can admit the tendencies bound up with the shadow and allow them some measure of realization. Tempered, of course, with the necessary criticism, this leads to disobedience, self-disgust, but also self-reliance, without which individual is unthinkable. What else do I want to say? Part of our potency and vitality is lost in repression. We all deny in ourselves whatever we perceive as inferior, evil, or unacceptable, and becomes part of our shadow. Anything incompatible with our chosen conscious attitude about ourselves regulates to the dark side. The personal shadow is the disowned self. The shadow self, the parts of us we no longer claim to be our own, including inherent positive qualities. These unexamined or disowned parts of our personality don't go anywhere. Although we deny them in our attempt to cast them out, we don't get rid of them, we repress them. They are part of our unconscious.